Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I am Billy and I'm joined by my co-host
Andrew. Bills, welcome back again for another podcast.
Andrew, we are back again and episode number 72.
Yes, we're absolutely going through them a lot quicker than I expected. It feels like we're still on episode 10, to be honest with you.
It's interesting when you get into the routine and stuff of it. It just seems like it's, when we were first doing it, it was one of those things that's really daunting task. And now it just seems like we're getting into the swing of things and it's just week in, week out, what we do.
At least we're saying that. We'll see whether the listeners feel the same, whether it's we've gotten on top of it and we're just going through it. Maybe they're saying you guys are worse now than when you first started.
Maybe, or even worse, we're actually just talking to ourselves and recording it.
Yeah, exactly.
And no one's listening to it. So. But hopefully there's enough juice in this topic because this one's a really great strategy. For I guess a select group of people.
Yeah.
So Andrew, run us in. What are we talking to everybody about today?
Yeah. So today, what we're talking about is it's basically a means to fund or to funnel additional money into superannuation, and it's via the Downsizer Contributions. And the Downsizer Contributions are exactly as what you'd expect. You're downsizing your family home and you're utilizing the difference between the property that you've lived in and sold for a cheaper property, and the difference between those property prices you're putting into superannuation.
Okay, so I think the coffee's still kicking in for me. Essentially, you're selling your family home and you're putting the proceeds into super, or some of the proceeds. Which we'll get into the nitty gritty and the detail of it in a sec.
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
So what we're looking at is can you do it? Who's eligible for it? And I think the kind of key element to it is, why would you do it?
Yeah, and I think we'll probably start with that because that's a really good point. Getting money into superannuation is probably the question that we need to answer in order to answer that question. Why would you do it? Like anything, you're using a tax effective environment, or you're taking advantage of a tax-effective environment to save for future retirement income.
Yep.
That's the broad brush statement as to why you would do it. There's a select opportunity with this particular strategy that if you're of a certain age and you meet a certain criteria, we'll talk about that shortly, but it's a way to boost your superannuation balance. And that was why the government had originally tried to do this. If you look across the demographic of Australia, a lot of a family's wealth is tied up in their family home. So it's a mechanism to try and release the equity, as people do when they downsize, to try and get that money to be able to convert it across into a form of income where people can actually use it and consume it. One, it's good for the government because it means that we spend our money and good for the economy. But two, what it does is it should increase somebody's standard of living because you've got more money to spend.
Yeah, exactly right. And look, downsizing is nothing new. It's something that people have been doing for, ages and ages. You consider that when you're, a little bit younger, you might have kids living at home. You might have, a larger family living under the same roof. And so as a result, you kind of need a little bit more space. You need a bigger property. And all of a sudden, once you start going into retirement, the requirement for such a large property isn't there. So as a result, you've got the ability to utilize what for most people is probably their most valuable asset, reduce the size of your home, move out a suburb, whatever it is, but basically sell your property for maybe $1 million, purchase something else for $750,000, and you've got $250,000 to supplement your retirement income. And I think that the real power in this is when you're considering someone that's doing Downsizer Contributions, putting money towards or putting that money towards superannuation. For most people, you're either retired or close to retirement, or you're over the age of 65. Now, if you're over the age of 60 and no longer working, permanently retired, or if you're over the age of 65, irrespective of your work status, your superannuation is tax-free. Income, capital gains, drawdowns, absolutely everything within superannuation is tax-free. And so that's why there's such a large drive of people wanting to, pump as much money as they can into superannuation, especially towards the later years, because they want to take advantage of that tax-free environment, obviously up until the transfer balance cap, which is now 1.7. Yeah.
Yep.
So that's ultimately the why. I mean, in terms of why you do it, you're moving money into a tax-free environment, and you're doing it at the very end, which is, I mean, whether it's right or wrong is up for debate, and we'll always be, we're always advocates for planning ahead and doing it slowly and progressively over time. But the other thing that it also does is it gives you the ability to pump in an extra, $300,000 per person at the point in time where your superannuation is likely to be very close to being accessible, if not already accessible, and tax-free. Because the conundrum for a lot of people is, get it, superannuation, great, from a tax perspective all the way through, but amazing from a tax perspective once you reach age 60 or age 65, depending on your work status. But I don't want to do it at the age of 45 because I don't want to tie up that money for the next 15 years. That's the conundrum that a lot of people are in, whereas this gives you the ability to pump the money in with a large sum all at the very end.
Yeah, so just on that note, the contribution, the downsizer contribution strategy, you can't do unless you're 55 years of age or older. But it's you're right, it's always that conundrum with somebody who's, in their mid-40s or whatever it may be, or, a long period out from accessing their superannuation. And this is one of the things that we talk about in terms of, you're forfeiting your benefit today and sort of, saving and contributing to your super, knowing that you can't access it for 15, 20 years, whatever the time frame is for that individual, and getting that balance right between today and tomorrow, knowing that there's a tax-free benefit by the time you're retired and meet those conditions, like what you were describing before, or a tax-effective environment, depending on what age you access your super, and getting that balance right between the two. Whereas this strategy is perfect, I think, because you're really, really close to accessing it, or you're already there. The other area that I tend to think about is that if you think about the tax-free status of your family home from a CGT perspective, depending on your age and your accessibility of superannuation, it actually continues in a tax-free status as well too. So you're taking, I'd say, an asset that you've got that you're not producing any income with. It did its job. Maybe you raised your family in there. It did its job. You need to downsize because it's too big. Maybe you've got an upstairs. You can't be bothered going upstairs, or no one's living in the house anymore. So you release that equity per se. You go and downsize to something smaller and more manageable, and then all of a sudden you've got a large pool of money. What do you do with it? Yeah. Do you leave it in a bank account? Do you invest it? Do you get taxed on it? If you put it into super, all of a sudden you've got two benefits. You've got the tax effectiveness, if not tax-free, but you've also got the fact that you've gone and increased, your income pool or your investable money by up to $600,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Great strategy.
Exactly.
Yep.
So we've spoken about the benefits. We've spoken about, why you do it, why you'd consider it, and who would actually utilize this strategy. Should probably take it a step back and talk about the specifics around what it is, how much you can contribute, and, where this ultimately lands. So yeah, Bills, take us through it.
So first things first, you're talking about your owner-occupier.
Yeah.
Right? So your owner-occupier property. Now, there are some specifics around that. You need to have owned the home for at least 10 years. And it needs to be exempt from CGT.
So capital gains tax. There's no capital gains
tax. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be living in the property. You could have owned that as a former family home and you're renting somewhere else.
Correct.
So either fully exempt from capital gains tax, which meets the owner-occupier definition, or partially if you've moved out.
Yep.
So 10 years, age 55 or older.
Yep.
You need to be.
Which has recently changed.
Yep. That's come down, which is great. It's added another, 5 years to it?
Yeah. I think it started off at 65, then it went to 60, and now it's 55, which is awesome because I don't know, personally, in my experience, when the age limit was 65, it was quite limiting in terms of who could utilize it. So yeah, absolutely think that's fantastic.
Yep. Per person, so you're talking about two members of a couple, per person, you can put into super as a downsizer contribution up to $300,000 each. And this is without impacting your concessional contribution cap or your non-concessional contribution cap.
Yeah.
So it's above and beyond the rules that exist today if you fit that criteria.
So let's
want to do some numbers?
I was going to say, and we're doing this on the fly, so apologies.
And the balance transfer cap. So you have to have a superannuation balance of less than 1.7 million in order to do this.
Yeah. So let's say you sold the property for $2 million.
Funny that I was going to pick that number so they're nice and round. Yep.
And let's say that you, in addition to that, let's say that you then purchased another property for $500,000. So you had a massive lifestyle change. You went from a massive house to an apartment and decided that you've got $1.5 million.
Or a tree change.
Yeah, exactly. Or a tree change, and you've got $1.5 million, and you want to be able to pump as much of that as you can into superannuation. So $300,000, and we're a couple, Billy. $300,000 for me.
Just on that note, same-sex couples, it's legitimate. So
$300,000 for me, $300,000 for you. So we've utilized $600 of the $1.5 million.
Yep.
In addition to that, we've also got our after-tax contributions, so our non-concessional contributions that we can also make. So if we have not made non-concessional contributions in the past, utilize the bring forward rule. Go back to previous episodes. We've talked about that in length as well. $330,000 each as a non-concessional contribution. So now we're at 660. So yeah, we're at
630 per person. We're up to 630 per person.
330, so 660.
300 plus 330.
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant our total non-concessional contributions. Yeah, so we're at 630 per person. So we're talking about $1.26 million that we've been able to pump in of that $1.5 million differential.
Yep.
The other thing that you can also utilize as well, if you so wanted to, now there's also obviously a tax element. So if you're taking an income, you might consider it. Maybe not if you're not actually earning an income. But the other thing that you can also throw on top of that is your catch-up concessional contributions as well. So that $27,500 a year that you're making in concessional contributions, you can catch up 5 years of unused contributions. So you could theoretically, in that scenario, almost pump in the full $1.5 million, or depending on your concessional contributions, even do the full $1.5 million.
Yep. Yeah. So you consider that where somebody's, say, approaching retirement or is retired, you've got a family home that's worth a substantial amount of money. You then downsize from a lifestyle perspective because, you don't want to be living in a larger house that it's more difficult to maintain. All of a sudden going from, okay, I've got my accommodation covered with my family home, but what am I going to do from a retirement income perspective? Because maybe you don't have a lot of superannuation or other assets to support yourself. All of a sudden you do a calculation like that and bang, you're in a position now where, let's assume just for the sake of it, we're close to the 1.5, but you've got 1.5 million of retirement assets that are investable that are giving you a tax-free income stream.
Yeah, and the alternative, just to
that's huge.
Well, just to drive home the impact of what this strategy does, and just to really sort of drive home the example of why someone in that situation would want to put that money towards superannuation as opposed to not. If this person was over the age of 65, let's say, or they were even over the age of 60 and no longer working, but let's assume that, Billy, you're probably only a few years off. Me, I've got a little bit longer to go.
There's no grey in the beard. I don't know if you can see that on the YouTube video,
but let's say $1.5 million in the superannuation environment, and let's assume that it's drawing an income of, 6%, just to sort of illustrate that as an example. 1.5 million in superannuation drawing an income of 6%, you're talking about a 90 grand a year income that's coming out of whatever that investment, right? 90 grand a year inside of superannuation, no tax at all. It's completely exempt from tax. You're under the $1.7 million balance transfer cap. In addition to that, you're either permanently retired or you're over 65. So your superannuation is 100% accessible. If you wanted to take out 10,000 to go for a holiday, if you wanted to take out 100 grand because you needed to, do X, Y, Z, you can access the money at any point in time, just like if money was in an investment outside of superannuation or if money was in your bank account. So there's no issues from a liquidity perspective. There's no issues from being able to access the funds, but there's zero tax on that income. You take the other example of not putting any of that money into superannuation and having $1.5 million invested, drawing an income of 90 grand a year, you're going to pay tax at marginal tax rates. On 90 grand a year, you're probably paying close to 30 grand tax.
Well, let's assume it's 45 each person. Here we go, 45 each. I was doing the calculations, so I'll help you out here. 45,000 each person. The first 20,000-ish is tax-free. And then on the subsequent 20 or 25, you'll pay about 20% in tax. So you're looking at 20% on $20,000, you're talking $4,000.
Yeah. So
$4,000 per person is $8,000. So all of a sudden your 90,000 goes down to 82.
Correct.
And this is each and every year as well.
Yeah.
So automatically, even without considering where you're investing it, you're $8,000 better off from a tax perspective in this example that we're using.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I get all of the time is, especially in the example that we're explaining, you may have somebody that hasn't been exposed to investment markets. So they turn around and they look at it and they say, you know what, I've been invested in property in my life. I don't understand super. I don't trust it. I like bricks and mortar. So what do? They downsize and they'll go to the bank and they'll stick it into term deposit. And at the moment in the environment that we're in, that's becoming a little bit more digestible because we're starting to get, some decent term deposit rates, albeit it's still lagging where it should be, but that's a podcast for another day. You can still invest money inside super to take advantage of the tax environment that we've been describing and put it in a term deposit. Yeah. So if that's what you know and that's what you feel comfortable with and it passes your sleep test, do that.
Yeah.
And take advantage of the tax environment that we've been describing. You can still do that.
Exactly right.
And I think that's probably something that's not greatly understood because I don't know about you, but I have that conversation all of the time. And when I talk to people about that, especially in an environment where you're dealing with, people that are close to or in retirement where, back in the day, term deposits used to get you a 7% rate of return and that was kind of it. Now we're starting to approach that environment where you can get, 3 or 4% with the term deposit. That's a viable option for them. And when they learn about the tax environment and you talk about those numbers, all of a sudden it's just like, wow, this is great. Let's go for that.
And you can mimic the exact same thing that you're doing outside of superannuation by putting it into a term deposit. The only difference is that the ownership of that term deposit is a superannuation fund. Doesn't change anything, from a day-to-day perspective because it's still, under the limitations of when you can withdraw it because of the term of that term deposit, but you're not paying any tax on the income.
No tax on the income. You still need to deal with and manage the liquidity requirements of it. In saying that, that's the product itself. So whether it was inside super or outside of super, that problem or that issue that you need to manage still exists. So it's more so when can you access it. But once again, if we're talking about downsizer contribution, you'd make an assumption that, obviously you're dealing with somebody at least over 55.
Yeah.
So the further in you get or the further away you get from 55, the closer you are to being able to access your superannuation.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think downsizing is a viable strategy for a lot of people because the other alternative is looking at, things like reverse mortgages that, that's probably a topic for another podcast because it's right for some people, it's wrong for a lot of people. And it definitely has some other ramifications. And this is another means to be able to really draw that equity out of, your greatest asset for a lot of people. Or for other people, act as a top up and give you the flexibility to be able to, not just survive off, the income that you might be deriving from an age pension or from many other assets that you might have, and trying to live within those means, but actually enjoy the retirement lifestyle and being able to go on a holiday and spend money on things like that.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. I mean, if you talk about Centrelink and in particular the age pension, the family home as it currently stands is exempt from the assets test when it comes to Centrelink. If you downsize and you take that money and even if you downsize, wherever you put that money, as long as it's not in another owner-occupier, which is the whole point of downsizing, that money then becomes accessible in the eyes of Centrelink. So you could go from a position of having a really valuable family home. We'll use the example before, $2 million. All of that $2 million doesn't even exist in the eyes of Centrelink if it's your family home. All of a sudden, you convert your $2 million owner-occupier to $500,000. That $1.5 million difference is now recognised and accessible in the eyes of Centrelink. So in this instance, it'd knock you out from the age pension completely.
Correct.
Right? The challenge that I guess we face is saying, okay, we're going to get, if we're entitled to the full age pension, we're going to get $35,000 from the government in terms of benefits versus zero. But using the example before, $35,000 as a couple versus say $90,000, you're talking about a substantial difference between the two. Doubling the amount of income, I'd say doubling the amount of, or the benefit of your lifestyle, I think that's a better outcome and that's a better choice than trying to preserve your assets, to try and shield your assets in order to get Centrelink. But once again, it's a pretty contentious issue because I guess back in the day, when you started working, the promise from the government was at the end of your working career for paying your taxes, you're going to be eligible for a pension.
Yeah, and that's definitely something to note, and definitely a talking point, especially when we're talking about this issue, is what's the impact to the age pension and how far do you push it? I mean, because the other example is instead of buying for, $500,000, you sell that $2 million property, you buy for $1.5 million, you preserve your age pension entitlements, and at the same time you still receive an income from the other assets that you have outside of that. So definitely receive advice is one of the things that as always on the podcast we think is absolutely imperative before you embark on anything like this, because you want to really take into account absolutely everything and be able to accurately look at, all right, this is my position before, this is my position after, what's going to be the best outcome for me and my family.
Yep. Probably one of the other things to point out is this strategy, and it kind of makes sense, but important to point out, can only be used once.
Yep.
For obvious reasons. Geez, it'd be nice if you could do it
properties
multiple times, but yeah, you can only use it once, right? So that's that. In terms of the actual mechanics behind it, so when you do it, there is a certain time frame that you need to notify the superannuation fund that you are making that contribution. From memory, Andrew, 90 days?
I believe so.
Yep.
This is from memory, so don't quote me on it. But yeah, I believe it's 90 days that you have to make that determination to the super fund.
So that way, the superannuation fund knows that when they add that contribution or when they classify that contribution to your superannuation account, it's considered as a downsizer contribution as opposed to a non-concessional contribution where you're potentially breaching your caps.
Yeah. And really important because it is quite a strict rule in terms of a time frame of when you need to do it. So don't make the downsizer contribution and think that you can do it come tax time or anything like that. Generally what I say is as you're making the contribution, you notify the super fund at the same time. That way there's an actual allocation between the money that's going in and how you'd like that money to be classified as well.
Yep. And because it's such a big move, I mean, you're talking about potentially putting $600,000 into super in one go. This is not something that you would do ordinarily without the advice of a financial advisor. It just isn't. It's too easy to make a mistake. It's too easy to breach the caps. The rules around superannuation are very, very strict for obvious reasons. The rules of preservation exist. So this is something that you'd need to be receiving advice on. And in our instance, when we are talking to people about it, it's part of a broader strategy. So it's something that's on the horizon where you know that, okay, the kids have moved out. We're getting to a stage where we're thinking about retiring or whatever it may be. We want to downsize the house. It's not a decision that you make to sell your house tomorrow. It's something that's in the works for a while. So it's usually, from our perspective, when we are giving the advice, it's something that we've been working on for a period of time and saying, hey, there is an opportunity available here. When the timing is right for you, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah. And, obviously working out the logistics of when you sell, when you purchase, how you, cover that point in time in between selling and purchasing, whether you try to marry up the period. So there's usually a lot more planning rather than just...
That's it.
We've sold and what do we do now?
True. Absolutely. Andrew, thank you.
Thanks, Bills, for
I reckon that was a good one and a bit of value on that one. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And thanks again to all of our listeners and viewers. Thanks for tuning in for another one of our podcasts. And if you want any details on this or anything else that we talk about, our details are in the show notes. And please make sure to like and subscribe so that you get updates for when there's new episodes coming out.
We'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we've talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.